Welcome, Facebook friends and family, to this week's Bible Topics discussion. Today we're continuing our talk about the spiritual gifts in part 2 of the series. Last week we said that most of the spiritual gifts come from the Holy Spirit, and that the gifts are discussed in Romans chapter 12, 1 Corinthians 12 and 14, and Ephesians 4. We covered Romans 12 last week, so we're moving on to 1 Corinthians 12 this week.
In verse 1, it starts by saying, "Now about spiritual gifts." This suggests that Paul is answering a question raised by the Corinthians in a letter to him. He goes on to say, "Brothers, I don't want you to be ignorant." Spiritual gifts are an important part of a healthy body of believers, and God doesn't want us to be ignorant about them either. In verses 4 through 6, Paul says there are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit. Different kinds of service, but the same Lord. And different kinds of working, but the same God works all of them in all men. These verses, reflecting the Trinity, show the diversity and unity of spiritual gifts.
Yep. In verse 7 it says, "Now to each one, the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. The indwelling Holy Spirit gives gifts of grace that are for every member of the body, given for the common good." Verse 8 begins to identify the gifts given. It says, "To one there's given the message of wisdom, to another the message of knowledge, to another faith, to another gifts of healing, to another miraculous power, to another prophecy, to another distinguishing between spirits, to another speaking in different kinds of tongues, and still to another the interpretation of tongues." Note that everyone does not get all the gifts. Verse 11 says that the Holy Spirit gives them to each one just as He determines.
I'm sure some of you are not sure about what these gifts really are. Let's define them. The message of wisdom is the special ability to know the mind of the Holy Spirit in such a way as to receive insight into how the given knowledge may best be applied to specific needs in the body. The message of knowledge is the ability that God gives to discover, accumulate, analyze, and clarify information and ideas for the growth and well-being of the body. The gift of faith is the ability to have extraordinary confidence in God's promises, power, and presence, so they can take heroic stands for the future of God's work in the church. The gifts of healing is the ability for certain members of the body to serve as human intermediaries through whom it pleases God to cure illness and restore health apart from the use of natural means. Notice gifts here is plural. This may suggest different kinds of illnesses and by various ways that God heals them. Please note that the one with the gifts is not the healer, but God is. Please also remember that God sometimes heals through the medical community.
You're right. The gift of miraculous power or miracles is that ability that God gives to complete an act of God intended as evidence of His power and purpose. Prophecy is the ability to receive and communicate an immediate message of God to His people through a divinely anointed utterance. Distinguishing between spirits is the ability to know with assurance whether certain behaviors claimed to be of God are in reality divine, human, or satanic. Speaking in different kinds of tongues is the ability, one, to speak to God in a language they've never learned, and or two, to receive and communicate an immediate message from God to His people through a divinely anointed utterance in a language they've never learned. Interpretation of tongues is the ability to make known the message of one who speaks in tongues so that the hearers can understand and be edified.
In verses 12 through 26, the Apostle Paul again compares the body of the church to a human body with many parts or members. To be a complete and healthy body, all the various parts are needed and work together, not independently of each other. The weaker parts of the body are not indispensable. However, in verse 28 it says, "And in the church God has appointed first of all apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then workers of miracles, also those having gifts of healing, those able to help others, those with gifts of administration, and those speaking in different kinds of tongues. But for those of us that do not have these gifts," verse 31 says, "but eagerly desire the greater gifts." So if you don't have any of these greater gifts, then pray that the Holy Spirit would give the ones to you that He determines.
Well, that's today's discussion. Again, please like, comment, and share. And always, if you have questions, you can private message us. Please come back next week as we cover part 3. See you next week. Be blessed.